Welcome everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of Enshrouded. Enshrouded is a crafted survival game developed and published by Keen Games. They released the game into early access in January 2024. So, obviously some things I mention in this review can possibly be irrelevant as they update and bring the game to its eventual full release. A couple other things to mention before I get into the review. First, I've only put in about 50 hours across two different playthroughs, a solo playthrough and a co-op one with my wife, split about evenly down the middle. Obviously I can't talk about endgame stuff, so take this review as a first impressions if it suits you. Also, I got this key from the publisher, so thank you Keen Games, but this will not affect any of my opinions about the game. Without further ado, let's get to the review. And starting off with the graphics, well, at a glance it looks rather decent, if all a bit uninspired and generic. The game has 5 biomes, although I'd argue that it only has 4 since the low meadowlands are basically an extension of the springlands where you start. The ones I've ventured into look nice and have appropriate feel for the respective biomes, being sweeping meadow/foothills and a dense forest. The environmental designers did a good job creating the pockets of Shroud as well, and making the land look blighted. I think the game's decision not to use procedural generation shines particularly well here, with their hand-placed structures and points of interest dotting the land. It made things a bit more immersive since each place felt lived in, from an animal's cave to a rundown house. The character models for the player characters are okay. Enshrouded can definitely benefit from an expanded character creator though. I'm not someone who spends hours in character creation, but even I was disappointed with the lack of customization the game had to offer. The enemies and NPCs all look decent and of the same quality as the rest, but I felt enemy designs were really generic fantasy. Nothing felt original, and I started getting bored of fighting the same enemies over and over since the biomes were so large and the game uses a level system. So a level 1 wolf is the same as a level 10 wolf, other than a few changes to the numbers. I would love to see more variety in this department. Even changing colors and sizes of certain enemies would go a long way. One thing I really enjoyed was how dark things would get with no light or at night. In many games, nighttime is usually bright enough that all the torches they provide the player don't really matter because you could see just as well during the day. However, that's not the case in Enshrouded. Although, if this does bug you, simply sleeping in a bed can fast forward through the night, and admittedly, I did that a lot while playing with my wife so she could keep building. Although, I will say that the transition from light to dark and vice versa with the passage of time was way too sharp and should be changed to make it a bit more gradual. Also, I did notice a few graphical bugs as well, but nothing that were too distracting and nothing game-breaking. Any story in Enshrouded is sparse and limited, as is usually the case with the survival crafting genre. What little that is here seems like an interesting setting, but beyond that, there's nothing here that substantial. The game starts with a cutscene that talks about how the world fell apart and how a dangerous fog, known as a Shroud, now infects the land of Embervale. The Ancients, some kind of old and powerful beings, and humans work together to create the Flameborn. These Flameborn are the only ones who could brave the Shroud and cleanse it from the inside. And, of course, the player takes the role of one such Flameborn. After this cutscene, everything is told through notes, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling. And all of that is done to varying levels of success. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of only learning about the world and story through collectible notes, but I think since they decided to create handcrafted locales, it allows for the notes to have more impact since they can directly coincide with the environmental storytelling as well. Such as finding a note talking about how a church took in some sick and wounded people, but then they died so they were laid to rest in the catacombs. And then once you go down into said catacombs, you find a lot of skeletons, presumably the ones laid to rest from the note. So little things like that are kinda neat to come across. One quality of life feature I really liked in Enshrouded is that each map marker, except for player-created ones, has an option to bring up the associated quest or codex logs so you could be reminded of the context. This worked well to keep the quests and notes a bit more relevant since I could actually remember the reason why I needed to go to these places in the first place. Now for the meat and potatoes as I move on to talk about the gameplay. Enshrouded borrows from other games and many survival crafting games that came before it. And if all you want to know is if the gameplay is any good, then yes, I think for the most part Enshrouded pulls everything together in a fun gameplay loop. There is definitely room for improvement though, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the beginning, you create your character and run through a short tutorial on the basics of the game. After that, the world is largely open for you to explore as you see fit. There are a bunch of points of interest to explore, with notes to read revealing more about the world, enemies to fight, and treasures to collect. Actually, I found that I never needed to craft any weapons since anything I found was much better than what I could actually craft. Armor wasn't quite the same, but I did eventually start finding better pieces compared to what I was able to craft at the time. So this probably needs to be balanced better unless the endgame has it where crafted weapons and armor are a lot better than anything you could find in the world. So far, I've also found it was the only way to get unique items that can't be crafted at all, which kind of makes sense. Occasionally, some of these points of interest also have puzzles to solve, which are usually in the form of jumping puzzles or hunting for switches to open up doors. It's nothing too complicated, but it's a fun distraction from other aspects of the game. And this map is big. Really big. To traverse it, the game gives players a glider for faster travel from high cliffs or towers, similar to Breath of the Wild. There's also a grappling hook, but that can only be used at specific grappling points. In order to help the player move across the map quicker, there are a few fast travel points, being the large towers, and each base the player places, but they are limited in how many can be placed at one time. At first, I was on the fence with how I felt about the fast travel, but the map is simply too big not to use it. Also, the game always spawns you in front of your last used base when you first get into a game, which I found incredibly annoying the first few times it happened to me because I thought I'd be where I left off. In fact, despite the several flame altars that I could place and make potential bases, I found that I was solely using them to place new fast travel points to push the border of where I was exploring. I'm unsure if this was the intent of the system, but I still like the idea of the devs introducing mounts as another way to facilitate rapid traveling across the map. And with that, we may as well talk about the Shroud, which is a major part of the game. I mean, it is called Enshrouded. The Shroud, as mentioned, is a dangerous fog that players can enter for Shroud-specific resources, exploration, and tackling Shroud routes to clear the Shroud. I'm using air quotes. When you enter the Shroud, a timer appears, and if it depletes, then you instantly die. There are ways to extend your time, whether from upgrading your flame altar at your base, getting a skill, using potions, or finding instant-use consumables in the Shroud. So because of this timer, you obviously can't just fast travel out of the Shroud and negate the mechanic. I really appreciated this because it forced me to plan out my expeditions into the fog and be more aware of my surroundings so that I could make a quick escape. Or, as often happened, doing a mad scramble trying to get out of the fog before I died. I really like the mechanic and look forward to how the danger might increase in later biomes and their respective Shroud pockets. The Shroud is also where you get a majority of your skill points to customize your build into several different playstyles. Many places in the Shroud have a route that can be cut down, and the Shroud is cleared in that area. Although, that's only true for a moment. Eventually, it will all spawn back, whether from leaving the world and jumping back in, or if it's on a timer. I'm not really sure. Either way, it breaks the immersion and the idea that, as the Flameborn, you're the only one who can cleanse the Shroud. I'm really hoping this is something that changes in future updates with the ability to clear the Shroud, or maybe even for it to spread. However, this lack of permanence in the world is seen throughout everything else. Any Terran manipulation or destruction of existing buildings is reset, and only construction, or deconstruction, a player can do is within their own base. This makes sense to me, and it's on par with other games, but items and chests can respawn as well. Many of them are random, but there are several that aren't, so if I wanted, I can get a quest-specific weapon over and over again. Luckily, or maybe not, depending on your preference, Shroud routes don't give a skill point every time they're cut down. Shifting gears, how's the combat? Because there's plenty of it throughout the exploration of the world. Well, Enshrouded offers a bunch of different weapons, from melee weapons such as swords and axes, but also wands, bows, and magical staves. And there's an extensive skill tree to spend skill points earned from leveling up and cutting down Shroud routes. I enjoyed getting new skills and trying to think of different builds, with a damage caster for my solo playthrough and a tanky melee warrior with the co-op campaign. Combat is fairly simple with an attack, a dodge, and a block. Certain skills can add a bit more complexity, such as a jump attack, but for the most part stays the same, or it has throughout the time I've put into the game. One thing I like about Enshrouded is a dedicated slot for a ranged weapon that you can use with the button press rather than needing to equip it as a primary, which means that most of the combat is done at close range. As a caster with the wand, you could keep a bit of distance, but the wand is not that far range, similar to something like a shotgun. Personally, I felt that using magic and ranged in particular made the game easier as long as you kept backing up. However, I did also have an easy time blocking enemy attacks with my melee build. That said, there was an enemy or two that did give me a bit of trouble, but I think this was due to me still using underleveled equipment and not good enough food for buffs. Although some enemies are more resistant against certain types of attacks, so some fights might be harder for some, depending on their build, or easier if they're playing with a friend or two. Actually, I didn't notice any sort of scaling to make fights more challenging in co-op, so they might be a lot easier. I briefly touched on this earlier, but Enshrouded uses a level system for their enemies, so this means you'll face a bunch of the same enemies, just at different levels. Nothing about them changes besides a few numbers, which really makes fighting them boring after a while. To add insult to injury, their drops don't even change, so a low-level enemy will still drop the same loot and quantity of the loot as a higher-level enemy, and you will see the same enemies even into new biomes, or at least the biomes I've been to. There are new enemies as well, but it's mixed with old ones, so they'll always be around. Overall, the combat here is decent and is definitely one of the better combat systems as far as the survival crafting genre is concerned. At the end of the day, it's a simple system though. The enemies and bosses don't have any complex attack patterns, and fighting usually involves dodging or blocking and then taking a shot. There's no real timing to speak of unless you're trying to parry, but I found it difficult to do and largely unnecessary anyway. Along the way, whether by following quests or your own exploration, you'll come across vaults that hold other NPCs that you could place at your base. These NPCs act as quest givers and crafting stations for more complex recipes, for equipment, consumables, and furnishings. And they are soulless husks. I get that they're supposed to add some story flair through quests, but I found them so uninteresting. They don't do anything but stand in the place you put them, which seems like it could have been easy to create some animations for them to use their associated crafting stations, just to add a bit of life to them. Also, their dialogue just doesn't really add much to the story or setting. Many of the notes you come across are written by these characters, but when you finally get to interact with them, they have nothing of note to say besides pointing you to your next quest objective. I get that the story isn't really a focal point for games like this, but since they put any emphasis on this at all, I feel it could be executed just a bit better. I talked about a lot of various gameplay aspects of Enshrouded, but I haven't really talked about the building, which is a pillar of this genre. Well, I can't say that I interact with these systems that much. When I play these games, I'm always playing with my wife, and she's the one that does the building. However, I did build a small house at the start, and I didn't mind their execution of the system. There's a lot of detail here for different shapes, but you can also fine-tune it down to individual blocks. There are a ton of different building materials and shapes to create a variety of things, and you can manipulate the terrain for different shapes or leveling. Although my wife and I did find it difficult to level the land with the rake, but maybe that needed some more practice. Structural supports aren't necessary either, so any weird or grand building designs might be a lot easier to create in Enshrouded than other games. I don't have enough creativity, time, or patience to engage with this system though, and I think the game realizes this. The building system felt largely peripheral, and as usually is the case with the genre, can be engaged with as much or as little as the individual wants to give. The most important thing is having a place to store your stuff, crafting benches, and having a good comfort level for your rested buff. However, I appreciated it, and I'm sure builders will really enjoy this system. A few miscellaneous things that I liked about Enshrouded were all systems the devs borrowed from Valheim. First, as I mentioned, the game has a comfort level similar to Valheim. Basically, any decorative items placed in your base will improve the comfort level and your overall rested buff, which provides better stamina maximum and regen. I like this because it encourages me to engage with the building system so I can make a house to place all these nice decorative objects. I could see why this might be a detriment to some though. Furthermore, Enshrouded also borrows how Valheim deals with repairing tools, weapons, and armor, as well as their food system. Any item with durability can't break completely, other than torches, and they don't cost any items to repair. Instead, you need to interact with your workbench, which I find highly convenient. Also, food isn't something that is a hard necessity, but instead you have a set number of slots to eat food, and the food all give various bonuses to your stats, health, stamina, etc. Also, one quality of life feature that my wife and I really liked was the ability to gift items into someone else's inventory. So no more dropping an item on the ground and fearing that it might disappear, or placing it into a chest for the other to pick up but then forget about. One last final note with the pre-made map acting as a double-edged sword to a player's enjoyment. At first, everything will feel fresh and the handcrafted nature makes for more interesting places to explore. There's not as much copy and paste as can be seen in other procedurally generated worlds from other games. However, once a puzzle or challenge is overcome, it makes it really hard to replay it again and get that same feel. Of course, you can replay the game though, and I've played many open world games multiple times. But many of those RPGs had interesting characters and stories to tell that made retreading old ground still interesting. Enshrouded doesn't have that and relies on the sense of exploration, combat, and building mechanics to drive the player. I suppose this is a good thing that the map is so big so players can constantly push forward to something new. I really wonder how keen I'll be to pick this up and start all over though, since the areas I explored at the start will always remain the same. Although, Conan Exiles has a map where everything is pre-made, and I've gone back to that several times. I think the difference with Conan is there's less hand-holding with showing you the game, so you feel that you could do whatever right away, and there's no progression gating from the quests. Additionally, Conan has introduced other events and features that could keep some of these areas fresh, which doesn't mean Enshrouded can't do the same. On that note, quests gate progression, so this is another thing that I can see as a point some people might have issues with. In order to create better armor or gain access to new recipes, you need to do quests for the NPCs. I really didn't like this since you will literally need to retread the same ground in order to make progress with crafting recipes and getting better gear or different building material. I think this is the biggest thing that ruins the game's replayability for me. Phew, that was a lot of things to cover, but we're finally at the final thoughts. But first, if you're enjoying the review or found it helpful, then please consider giving it a like as this helps me out greatly with the YouTube algorithm gods. Enshrouded runs for $29.99 USD, and I put about 50 hours into the game spread across 2 playthroughs. There's a ton of game here, and I definitely see myself putting in another 50 hours at least, but probably a lot more than that. And that's just with my co-op playthrough since I traditionally only play these games with my wife. That said, I did have fun playing this game solo, and I think that it's completely viable to do so, at least with how far I've gotten. And of course, given that Enshrouded is in early access, we can expect a lot more updates from the team. They've recently released a roadmap of things that they plan on putting into the game in the future. Some of the things that appeal to me most are new enemies and bosses, as well as new biomes with new points of interest to come across, and also townsfolk NPCs, which I hope will do a lot to bring our bases to life. The developers, Keen Games, do have some background in making these games, with their fairly well-received Portal Knights being a title released prior to Enshrouded. They provided support to that game for years with updates and DLC, so I expect Enshrouded will receive the same treatment, especially since it seems to have done a lot better than Portal Knights in such a small amount of time. Actually, as of writing this, the devs pushed a major update recently that added in new content in the form of massive dungeons, some quality of life changes, balances, etc. So I think things are looking really bright for the game's future development. Overall, Enshrouded is really fun and a good addition to the survival crafting genre, but it has some flaws that I hope will be addressed in future updates. For any who wanted to give it a go but weren't sure if the price merited what you get in early access, then I'd say you can definitely jump in now and get great value. And those are my thoughts on Enshrouded. I might return to this and make an updated review if my thoughts change by the endgame, or if a new update comes along that substantially changes the game. If you played the game, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't, then let me know if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.